Hey YouTube, so in this video I want to talk a little bit about error theory and intuition. Okay, error theory. So an error theory of a particular domain will say that all of our beliefs about that domain are false. So take for instance moral error theory. According to moral error theory, when we make moral judgments, we are expressing beliefs about objective moral properties. But there are no objective moral properties, so all moral judgments are false. So when I say, for instance, slavery is wrong, I am attributing the property of wrongness to slavery, but there is no property of wrongness, so the claim slavery is wrong is false. So moral error theory is one fairly influential kind of error theory, but of course there can be error theories about all sorts of other domains as well. I could be an error theorist about colour, for example. So I might say that all of our judgments about colour, all of our ordinary judgments about colour, are just false. So if I say that the car is red, well, maybe when I say that the car is red, this presupposes that there is a certain type of objective property of the surface of the car. So maybe our colour judgments presuppose that colours are objective properties of surfaces of objects, but then when we reflect on colour and look at colour science, it turns out that we can't maintain that kind of view of colour. So all of our ordinary judgments about colour come out false. There are no properties that answer to our colour concepts. Or I might be an error theorist about causality. Maybe I think that really there is no causality, and so I might say that all of our ordinary causal judgments are false. So the way that error theory usually proceeds is it will analyze a particular area of discourse as involving the expression of beliefs, and then it will give some sort of argument to the effect that those beliefs all come out false. Now, error theories tend to be given fairly short shrift by philosophers. I think the usual... So there's an assumption, I think, that error theories kind of carry a very great theoretical cost. So error theory is, a position of last resort, right? Like okay, maybe if nothing else works, we might be forced to accept an error theory, but really we should avoid error theory if we can. There's a presumption against attributing massive falsehoods to people. One reason for this is because these days a lot of philosophers will say that it is a cost if a theory is counterintuitive. Maybe the way that we should proceed in philosophy is by a kind of reflective equilibrium method, where we begin with various intuitions, various pre-theoretical judgments, and we're looking for a philosophical theory that accommodates, most of those intuitions while also exhibiting other theoretical virtues. But if that's the way that we're approaching things, then error theory seems to be off the table, because error theory, or so the argument goes, error theory just massively violates our intuitions. To say that all of our moral judgments are false, well, that's extremely counterintuitive. That means that, that means that for any given moral intuition I have, right, that intuition is just completely misleading. So error theory ends up violating intuitions. That's one reason why philosophers might be suspicious of error theory. Another reason is just that we often assume a kind of principle of charity. We should interpret people in such a way that maximizes the truth of their beliefs. So it's going to be a cost if a theory makes most of our ordinary beliefs come out false. There's a great deal of suspicion about error theories because of the way in which error theories tend to have these supposedly counterintuitive consequences. I've talked a little bit in other videos about the use of intuitions in philosophy, and I think there are good reasons to be suspicious about the sort of weight that philosophers put on intuition. But let's just sort of grant that for the sake of argument, right? Let's suppose that, yes, it's a cost if a theory is counterintuitive. I'm not really so sure that error theory is in such bad shape, even if we assume that, because I'm not so sure that error theories are actually as counterintuitive as they are sometimes said to be. So that's what I want to talk about here. Okay, so why might error theories actually be a bit more intuitive than is sometimes said? Well, I mean, one point that I would make is it seems to me that there's actually a great deal of what is said in ordinary conversations that is actually just false. People will utter falsehoods all the time. I mean, in ordinary discourse, we exaggerate, we simplify, we make jokes. We often use metaphorical language. So one very plausible way of interpreting metaphors is that when we use a metaphor, we are saying something that is literally false, but then we're using this literal falsehood because it kind of implicates something that might be true. But the point is that, you know, we have all sorts of goals in conversations, and those goals are not always served by just stating truths. And very often a lot of what we say, again, it's exaggerated, it's simplified, it is literally false. Maybe it's approximately true, but not perfectly true. We don't always aim for perfect truth. Very often we just aim to say something that's like true enough. And so when we think about like an error theory, well, I mean, the claim that's being made by the error theory is that these judgments are false. But it may well be that those judgments, although they are false, they are still getting at something close to the truth, or they're still getting at, like, you know, something in the vicinity of the truth. So let's say, for instance, that I'm an error theorist about colour. I say that all of our ordinary judgments about colour are false. So if I say that, you know, the car is red, that comes out as being false. And the reason why it comes out as being false is because our colour concepts presuppose that colour is an objective property of the surfaces of objects, but there is no such property. Okay, let's say that that's my view. Well, you know, look, that may be false. So the car is red may be false, but there may be something in the vicinity of this sort of judgment that comes out as being true. So in particular, although colours are not objective properties of the surfaces of objects, even so, our colour perception, we might think, does track certain objective regularities in the world. And maybe this is more kind of, you know, this isn't just a matter of like, okay, this is an objective property of a surface of objects, but there are distinctions between objects, there are distinctions between surfaces, and, you know, colour perception allows us to track those differences. And so when we make these colour judgments, like that's one of the roles that colour judgments play, is that it allows us to kind of group things together in ways that are useful to us. So the judgment is false, strictly speaking, but it's kind of near to the truth, right? And so that's why we use it. So, and again, that's, I think, quite ordinary, right? Like, ordinary discourse involves exaggerations, simplifications. And it also involves just outright lies, right? People will often just lie, or, you know, for diplomatic purposes. Sometimes the lies that we tell are known by everybody involved in the conversation. And so maybe they're not really lies, but they're like falsehoods. They're kind of like half lies. They're like falsehoods that are known to be false by everyone in the conversation. Here's an example, right? Let's say there's two people in a relationship, and, you know, one person says to the other that, you know, you're the most beautiful person in this room, or you're the most beautiful person in the world. And maybe they both know that what is said there is not true. Maybe it's not true because you think that there's no such objective property of beauty. Maybe it's not true because it's not really even an honest expression of what this person thinks. So when somebody says, you're the most beautiful person in the world, maybe they're not being entirely honest about their own sentiments there, right? And everybody knows that, but the statement is still acceptable. It's still something we might say, because really the point is not to state a truth. The point is to express love, right? So a false statement is being used where everybody kind of knows it's false, but we sort of pretend not to. You know, we kind of go along with the pretense because it's a nice way of expressing love. So the first point I would make about error theory is, well, it's not clear to me, just in general, like why we would think there's something so problematic about attributing massive falsehoods to people. And when it comes to things like, the principle of charity, okay, so yes, maybe we should be charitable when interpreting others. But I'm not sure that charity means that we have to interpret others as expressing things that are true. I mean, it might just be that charity involves, okay, well, when you interpret others, assume that their beliefs are largely rational, right? Like, you should kind of maximize the rationality of the sorts of beliefs that you're attributing to other people. And there's nothing irrational about holding lots of false beliefs or saying lots of false things. So some forms of the principle of charity are going to be, I think, entirely compatible with people just having these massive errors. Okay, so this is one point, right? Is that actually a lot of ordinary speech and ordinary thinking involves falsehoods. So I'm not really sure why it's necessarily so problematic for an error theorist to say, okay, well, there's this whole domain, like the moral domain, or the domain of color discourse or causal discourse, where actually we just say things that are false. So another point about error theory, right? Do error theories violate intuition? Well, a lot of this, I think, is going to depend on exactly what the content of an intuition is. And that's unclear, right? So take moral error theory. The idea is that moral error theory is going to violate pretty much all of our moral intuitions, because the error theorist is saying all of those intuitions are false. So this is somehow, throwing out all of those intuitions. And then, of course, somebody who's against error theory might kind of do a Morean shift where they say, well, like, no, our trust in those intuitions is going to be greater than our trust in any philosophical principle that is used as part of an argument to the effect that those intuitions are false. So if you have a conflict between a philosophical theory and a huge class of our intuitions, then the intuitions win, right? Like, you should reject the philosophical theory. And so this is, I think, a very common reason why people reject moral error theory and other error theories. They'll say, well, no, right, we should have more trust in our moral intuitions than in the philosophical theory. But the problem is that what is it that we're actually trusting when we trust our moral intuitions, for instance? So I have the intuition that torture is wrong. Yes, I do. Right? If you ask me, is torture wrong? I will say yes. And that's kind of just a pre-reflective judgment. It's something I haven't really thought about that much. It's just kind of like an immediate gut reaction, right? I read about torture and I'm like, no, I have a negative response to it. So I do have the intuition that torture is wrong. But do I have the intuition that it is true that torture is wrong? That's not so obvious. I mean, yeah, okay, so I have the intuition that torture is wrong. I'm willing to get on board with that. But I'm not really so sure that I have the intuition that it is true that torture is wrong. And so when the error theorist says that this intuition is false, it's not really clear to me that the error theorist is actually violating the intuition. Because, the error theorist does not deny that people have moral intuitions. What the error theorist says is that all of our moral judgments are false, right? So the error theorist says, when you say that torture is wrong, it's false. The error theorist isn't denying that people think that torture is wrong. No. Okay, so I have the intuition that torture is wrong, but that's totally compatible with error theory. If I was to say it is true that torture is wrong, that would be incompatible with error theory. But it's not clear to me that that's what my intuition is. Now, I mean, look, I'm just speaking for myself here. Maybe you, the viewer, maybe you really strongly have the intuition that it is true that torture is wrong. Maybe, but it's worth, I think, reflecting on this. Are you sure? Are you sure that you don't just have this kind of inclination to say that torture is wrong? Like, are you sure you know what the difference is between those things? So, okay, you have the inclination to say that torture is wrong, and you also have the intuition that it is true that torture is wrong. Like, are you sure? So similarly, okay, you take like the car is red. The error theorist says that's false because red presupposes objective color properties and there are no objective color properties. But I mean, look, the intuition here is just the car is red. All this stuff about objective color properties, I'm not sure that that's part of the intuition. The intuition is just this bare, I mean, to me anyway, it's just this sort of bare inclination to say something, to like make a judgment about color. Then, like the way that we get to error theory is because, well, we start to investigate this inclination a bit, and we sort of start to say, okay, what's actually presupposed by our color concepts, and does anything answer to those concepts? But that's got, it seems, I'm not sure that that really has anything to do with our intuitions, right? Our pre-reflective judgments. So the fact that the error theorist is saying that all of these intuitions are false, it's not clear to me that that actually is in conflict with those intuitions. And again, you can just insist, no, I have the intuition that there are moral truths. I have the intuition that there are truths about colour, that the car is red is true. Maybe. But I would suggest that in denying those intuitions, we're actually not attributing massive error to people. So again, all that's, all that we have with the kind of like ordinary intuition is just an inclination to say something, right? To say like, yeah, torture is wrong or the car is red. It's not so obvious that this is a matter of asserting the truth of those things. And I guess more generally, like maybe one way to put this is to ask, like, what exactly would it be for a theory to vindicate or accommodate intuitions? I mean, I guess the usual assumption here is that in order for a theory to vindicate our intuitions, the theory must say that those intuitions are true, or that like what is asserted by statements that express those intuitions, the content that is asserted by those statements is true. So the usual view would be that in order to vindicating our moral intuitions is going to mean saying that statements like torture is wrong are true. But I'm not really sure why this would be. Like, why is that the only way to vindicate an intuition? Why isn't it enough for a theory to say that those sorts of statements are useful, or that those sorts of statements are assertable, or that those statements are approximately true? So if I say that, like, error theorists, generally speaking, are not, like, if I'm a moral error theorist, I'm probably not going to be a moral abolitionist. Now, there are some error theorists who are moral abolitionists. They will say that we should just, we should just eliminate morality, we should eliminate moral judgment, but that's a very minor part of that tradition, right? Most error theorists are quite happy to preserve moral judgments. Moreover, usually error theorists will give an account of why a particular domain of discourse has arisen. They'll give an account of the sort of function that it's supposed to serve. So if you look at moral error theorists, they don't just say that our moral judgments are false, they will give an account of why we make moral judgments. They'll give an account of the sort of role that it plays, the function that it serves. And this is a case for error theorists in general, right? Like, error theorists about colour will give an account of the sort of purposes that colour discourse serves. And usually, error theorists are quite happy to preserve the discourse. They're happy to say, look, okay, maybe moral discourse emerged in order to serve some sort of role of promoting social cooperation, and yes, this is very useful, this is something worth preserving, so this is why we should preserve moral discourse. So what it seems to me that actually what we have there is a theory that in a pretty important sense vindicates moral intuitions. So maybe, like, let's just grant that if error theory is true, then the intuitions are false. Let's just grant that when I have this intuition, torture is wrong. Yes, that really is just a matter of making the judgment that torture is wrong, and indeed that is false. But the error theorist will say, well, look, these sorts of judgments serve this purpose and they're useful or they're assertable, or even maybe they are approximately true, right? Maybe we use these things which are like semantically false, but like they pragmatically imply something that is true. So why isn't that like a vindication of those intuitions? The fact that I have all of these moral intuitions and they are serving some useful purpose, or they are false, but maybe they're like sort of used to express some other truth. That seems like a vindication to me. So I'm not sure that the fact that the error theory, if it's true that error theory will judge that these intuitions are false, I'm not sure that this entails that the theory fails to vindicate those intuitions. And again, that seems to be the sort of issue, right? Like the idea is that, well, the problem with error theory is that it's highly counterintuitive because it's not vindicating our intuitions. So I think that there's maybe more, like maybe we should sort of be a bit more reflective about, well, what would actually count as vindicating intuitions? And I'm not sure that error theory really performs so badly there. Okay then, so those were just some thoughts about error theory and intuition. I think that error theory, even if we assume the kind of usual methodology of modern analytic philosophy, I think error theory might have much more going for it than is usually assumed. I don't think it's anywhere near as counterintuitive as is usually assumed. And so I will leave the video with that. I think I've said enough about that. So thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.